They told me to stand outside a ceremony built on my own work. They thought I was just a quiet female analyst. Easy to erase. Easy to exploit. Easy to replace. What they did not know was that the laptop in my hands carried more than data. It carried evidence. Resignation letters. Client agreements. Patent filings. And a plan I had prepared for 3 years. The moment they told me I did not deserve a seat in that room, I decided to take everything back. I think you should wait outside. The sentence landed in the conference foyer like a crystal glass shattering across cold marble. I stood still. My hands wrapped around a thick presentation folder filled with 6 months of research. 6 months of late nights. Skip dinners. And weekends that no longer belonged to me. The room in front of me was spacious enough to hold several more tables. Yet Monica Reed, the marketing director, looked at me as if my presence were an error in the guest list. Behind her, my colleagues from the department were already seated at cream-covered tables. I even saw Allison Pierce, the new intern who had not been with the company for long, sitting near the executive section with a smug smile. She was the same intern who had presented my supply chain optimization framework at the board meeting the previous month. After changing a few surface-level terms and taking the full spotlight, I asked, so quietly that I barely recognized my own voice, "Excuse me, what do you mean?" Monica gave a small shrug and said the ceremony was already at capacity. But there was no apology in her eyes. There was only contempt, dressed in a thin layer of professional manners. Inside, the large projection screen displayed the words Innovation Excellence Award. That should have been my moment. Not because I was hungry for applause, but because after so many times being erased from my own work, I had hoped that truth might finally be allowed to stand upright. Then Monica added that I was just an analyst. Something inside me stopped hurting. In its place came a terrifying clarity. I opened my laptop, looked at her one last time, and said, "I understand. Check your email." I did not shout. I did not argue. I did not try to force my way into that room to claim the chair that should have been mine. There are moments when silence is not surrender. Sometimes, silence means a decision has already fully formed. I pressed send on the email I had prepared in advance. Attached to it were my resignation letter, the resignation letters of 7 others, client transition notices, preliminary patent filings, documentation proving independent ownership, and the press release scheduled to go out the following morning. As email notifications began chiming throughout the hall, I heard the conversations inside slow down. Then came a few more alerts. Then the scraping of chairs. I did not need to turn around to imagine their faces changing color. Nathan Cole was probably opening the first file with his usual irritation, only to become confused when he realized this was not an ordinary complaint. The CEO was likely staring at the list of clients preparing to leave. Legal was probably discovering that the system they had dismissed had been developed independently. On my own computer, outside business hours, with my own resources. I walked down the corridor and closed the door behind me. The panic was trapped inside, leaving only the sound of my heels against the stone floor. 3 years earlier, I had imagined that leaving the company would feel like grief. But in that moment, I did not feel loss. I felt weight falling from my shoulders. I had not destroyed them in a fit of rage. I had simply removed what they had always taken for granted: my intelligence, my labor, and my loyalty. My name is Clara Whitman. And until that ceremony, I was the senior data analyst at Meridian Freight Systems, one of the fastest-growing logistics companies in the country. I have an almost photographic memory and a gift for finding patterns inside data chaos that most people ignore. Those traits made me excellent at my job, but painfully unprepared for office politics. I used to believe that, if I worked well enough, the results would speak for themselves. I was the kind of person who arrived early, stayed late, spoke plainly, did the work, and thought solving problems mattered more than standing beside the right person at internal events. I was wrong. 3 years at Meridian taught me that in a toxic environment, competence does not automatically protect the competent. Ideas can be taken. Names can be removed from reports. Meetings can be held without the person who built the foundation being invited. Each time it happened, I told myself I was being too sensitive, that it was probably a misunderstanding, that if I kept proving my value, one day they would recognize it. Recognition never came. What came instead were missed promotions, stolen credit, and praise handed to people who merely repeated what I had built. If you have ever been overlooked, if you have ever watched someone else receive credit for your labor, comment number 1. So I know you understand that feeling. Because being pushed to the edge taught me one expensive lesson: patience is not only a virtue, in the right hands, it can become the sharpest weapon. I grew up in a small town where my father managed the local library and my mother taught high school mathematics. My childhood was surrounded by books, formulas, chalkboards, and the simple belief that people who did good work would eventually be seen. My father often told me that knowledge was something no one could take away from you. My mother believed logic would defeat manipulation. As long as you stayed calm enough to prove your case, I carried those beliefs into adulthood like a reliable map. When I completed 2 master's degrees and joined Meridian, I thought I had found the perfect place to grow. The company constantly promoted itself as an organization that respected innovation, valued efficiency, and rewarded breakthrough thinking. During my first year, everything seemed to confirm that belief. I built an inventory tracking system that reduced errors by 37%. I developed predictive models that helped clients optimize shipping routes. I also discovered a serious flaw in the flagship software, one that could have cost the company its largest client if it had not been fixed in time. Each time, I followed protocol. I submitted reports, presented through management, provided complete data, and waited for feedback. At first, I did not care whether my name was mentioned in every meeting. I told myself I was a specialist, not someone chasing applause. Lauder, I understood the cost of letting other people tell the story of your work. Eventually, they begin rewriting your role in that story. By the time you realize you have been changed from the architect into a background shadow, kindness alone is rarely enough to reclaim fairness. Things truly began to change when Nathan Cole became the head of my department. He arrived with an impressive reputation, the executive who could turn weak teams around, the person who transformed struggling divisions into success stories. What his record did not show was the method behind those results. Nathan was skilled at identifying talented people, but not so he could elevate them. He identified them so he could extract from them. The first time it happened, I tried to believe it was a misunderstanding. I had developed an algorithm that predicted shipping delays using weather data, port congestion, and cargo flow density. After presenting it privately to Nathan, I waited for feedback so I could refine it. 2 weeks later, during a meeting with senior leadership, he introduced the exact model as his own strategic initiative. My name was not mentioned once. After the meeting, I stayed calm and said, "The predictive model today was strong. I'm glad it was approved." Nathan looked at me as if I had misunderstood my place. He said the conceptual framework was his and that I had merely helped with some numbers. I stood there stunned. The idea, the structure, the input variables, and the testing had all been mine. But because I still wanted to prove I was collaborative, I stayed quiet. That was my first mistake. And if you are following this story, please like this video. Not because I want to dwell on resentment, but because many people need the reminder that silence after the first injustice can make the second one arrive much faster. After that, a pattern repeated with frightening precision. I would identify a problem, build a solution, show it to Nathan, and weeks later, watch him present it to leadership as if the idea had appeared in his head that morning. Sometimes I wondered whether I was being too rigid about credit. But every report with my name removed, every slide deck reassigned, every compliment redirected away from me left a small cut behind. One day, after gathering enough courage, I went to Victoria Hayes in Human Resources. I brought original files, edit histories, first drafts, and email chains proving when I had developed each initiative. I thought evidence would force them to take me seriously. Victoria listened while barely looking away from her screen. She asked whether I had documentation proving the ideas belonged exclusively to me. I said I had the original files with clear creation dates. Then she asked whether I had created them during working hours and with company resources. When I said yes, she concluded that they belonged to the company, not to me as an individual. According to her reasoning, Nathan was my supervisor. So, presenting departmental achievements to leadership was part of the proper chain of command. I left her office with a cold feeling in my chest. It was not because I failed to understand internal ownership rules, it was because I understood the real message. The system had not been built to protect the people who created value. It had been built to protect the people with titles. From that day forward, I began saving everything. Not to complain anymore, but to prepare. 6 months before the ceremony, I found a serious pattern of inefficiency in Meridian's cross-continental shipping routes. Other teams had grown used to treating it as an unavoidable cost. But the data told me otherwise. I spent multiple weekends building an entirely new logistics framework that combined demand forecasting, par condition, storage capacity, fuel volatility, and seasonal delay behavior. When I ran simulations, the results made me check my work again and again. Costs could be reduced by 27%, while delivery times could improve by 42%. This was not just a good report. It was the kind of initiative that could shift the company's position in the market. I prepared a detailed presentation and practiced late into the night before the quarterly strategy meeting. That morning, I wore my most polished outfit, arrived early, and carried my materials with a mixture of anxiety and hope. But just outside the meeting room, Nathan stopped me. He said leadership's agenda was tight, that the presentation needed to be streamlined, and that I should give him my materials so he could incorporate the key points into his overview. I hesitated, then handed them over. 3 hours later, I sat in the meeting like a helpless spectator, watching Nathan rush through my work in only a few minutes, skipping the most important innovations and presenting it as an unfinished side note. The initiative was shelved for further review. I left that meeting feeling as if I had watched someone deliberately distort something I had created, then use that distortion as proof that it did not deserve to exist. Not long afterward, Allison Pierce joined the team as an intern. She had an elite degree, polished manners, a smile for every room, and most importantly, she was the CEO's niece. Within weeks, Allison was invited to meetings from which I had been excluded under the excuse that my presence was not necessary yet. I tried not to judge her too quickly. Part of me still wanted to believe that ability and connections could coexist without destroying fairness. Then it happened. Allison presented a new logistics framework to senior leadership under a different name, with a few recolored charts and altered terms, while the core was so familiar that I could recognize my own fingerprints inside it. It was my work. A version taken, repackaged, and handed to someone with the right family connection. This time, the initiative was approved immediately. Allison was praised as a rising star, offered a permanent role, and celebrated in the internal newsletter. When I confronted Nathan, he did not even look uncomfortable. He said Allison's approach reflected senior leadership priorities more effectively and that my version lacked business perspective. Then he said something I never forgot: this is business. Clara, results matter more than who came up with what first. If you are listening this far and have not subscribed to the channel, subscribe now to keep following stories about how people reclaim their power when they are pushed into a corner. Because that sentence made my decision for me. If they worshipped results above all else, I would show them the real result of undervaluing the person who created the value. That night, I sat in my apartment surrounded by hard drives, notebooks, printed reports, and 3 years of scattered work that formed a long record of my own naivety. I had helped Meridian save millions, retain major clients, identify system risks, and improve operations. Yet my salary had barely moved. My title had not changed, and my reputation had been worn by others like a perfectly tailored coat. I did not cry. Maybe I had already cried enough in earlier moments, back when I still believed tears could wash away the feeling of betrayal. This time, a door simply closed inside my mind. I understood that if I stayed, I would become an accomplice in my own erasure. So I began a new project. I told no one at the company. I did not access it from a work device. I did not save it on internal systems. I did not develop it during business hours. I used my personal computer, personal accounts, personal time, and personal discipline. I returned to the original logistics framework. Not to improve it for Meridian, but to elevate it into something Allison's copied version could never reach. I identified weaknesses, added predictive layers, redesigned allocation logic, built self-correction mechanisms for real-world volatility, and created a system that could stand independently as a complete product. Every line I wrote carried a strange new feeling. It was no longer the wish to be recognized. It was the determination never again to place the fate of my intellect in the hands of people who only knew how to exploit it. Technology, however, was only half the plan. The other half was evidence. I began organizing every instance in which my work had been appropriated. I stopped keeping those memories as a vague list of injuries in my head and turned them into a formal record. Original files, creation dates, drafts, outgoing emails, meeting calendars, Nathan's final presentations, internal newsletters, quarterly reports. Everything was arranged into a timeline. I also began meeting former Meridian employees who had left quietly. At first, I invited them for coffee, under the simple reason that I wanted career advice. But as our conversations deepened, their stories opened like pieces of the same larger picture. Paige Bennett from product development had left after a patent-worthy innovation was claimed by her manager. Owen Brooks from client relations resigned after his strategy for retaining the company's largest account was presented by a vice president without his name attached. The more I listened, the more I understood that this was not about a few bad individuals. It was a systematic culture where creators were drained and internal politicians were rewarded. But something more important happened. I realized I was no longer alone. Those conversations created a network of talented people who had been underestimated, hurt, and still had not lost their ability to create value. They did not need to be convinced that Meridian had a problem. They had lived inside that problem. What they needed was another option. I began to understand that maybe I was not only preparing to leave, maybe I was preparing to build a place where people like us would no longer have to ask permission to be seen. 3 months before the ceremony, I met Helen Crawford, a venture capitalist known for funding companies bold enough to disrupt aging industries. I entered her office with 2 presentations. The first showed my upgraded logistics framework, developed independently, and capable of changing how large-scale shipping operations were managed. I explained the cost-saving models, the predictive layers, the way the system responded to port congestion, extreme weather, and demand volatility. Helen was not easy to impress. She asked sharp questions, cutting into every assumption, every metric, every legal barrier, every question of scalability. I answered with data, because data had always been the language I trusted most. When she said the system could transform the sector, I did not feel immediate joy. I felt a brief sadness, because something Meridian had dismissed as unworthy was visible to an outsider after only 1 meeting. Then Helen asked why I would leave a secure position to start from nothing in such a competitive industry. That was when I opened the second presentation. On the screen were profiles of 7 professionals who had committed to joining if the project received funding. Paige, Owen, and 5 others, each of whom had created major value while being made smaller by the old system. I told Helen I was not starting from nothing. I was starting with technology, potential clients, operational experience, and a team that understood exactly what the industry was doing wrong. For the first time in the meeting, Helen's expression changed. She was no longer evaluating only an idea. She was seeing a company. 2 weeks later, Helen committed funding. A month after that, I had leased a small office in a converted industrial space under a holding company to avoid drawing attention too early. We named the new company Astra Root Labs. To me, the name did not just sound modern. It suggested new routes, new orbits, paths drawn by our own hands rather than maps imposed by someone else. I worked with attorneys to finalize preliminary patent filings for the upgraded system framework. I reviewed every clause in my old employment agreement, every confidentiality rule, every boundary between company property and independently created work. I did not want revenge built on recklessness. I wanted to leave so cleanly that they could not drag me back through legal threats. At the same time, I discreetly contacted clients who had expressed frustration with Meridian's slow innovation, inflexibility, and repeated failure to meet performance commitments. I did not insult my former employer. I simply presented a better option. 5 major clients agreed to sign preliminary agreements that would take effect when Astroroot Labs officially launched. Everything gradually moved into position, like data points in an optimized model. I only needed the right moment to step into the light. Then the award ceremony announcement arrived. Allison Pierce would receive the Innovation Excellence Award for the logistics framework that had originated from my stolen work. When I read the internal email, I did not feel offended anymore. I only saw perfect irony. They had built the stage themselves. All I had to do was choose the right moment to open the curtain. On the morning of the ceremony, I woke earlier than usual. Not because I was excited to be honored, but because I knew I was about to cross a line I could never uncross. I chose a dark blue dress. Modest, but strong. The kind of clothing that made me feel I did not need to raise my voice to be visible. I applied light makeup, tied my hair neatly, and checked my laptop 3 times. The presentation folder I carried was no longer there because I expected a chance to speak. I carried it as a symbol, so they could see one last time what they had believed they could take from my hands without paying a price. When I arrived at the hall, colleagues were filing in, laughing, collecting name tags, and finding their assigned tables. Nathan was guiding Allison toward a seat near the executive table, looking proud, like a coach presenting a brilliant student. Even though both of them knew whose foundation that brilliance stood on, Monica Reed was checking the seating list. When she saw me, she frowned as if I were an unscripted detail. Then she told me I could wait outside. For a few seconds, I could hear the blood in my ears. Not because the sentence shocked me, but because it contained everything I had endured: contempt, exclusion, and the confidence of people who believed value creators would always remain quietly behind the curtain. I looked into the room, at the awards screen, at Allison's smile, then back at Monica. All my old emotions settled into a flat, still lake. I opened my laptop, pressed send, and said only one sentence: check your email. By the time I reached the parking garage, my phone had begun vibrating continuously in my pocket. The CEO's name appeared first. I declined the call. Then Nathan. Then Victoria from Human Resources. Then a stream of messages arrived like system warnings. I did not open them immediately. I wanted to enjoy the first few minutes after leaving the building without letting their voices back into my head. But when I reached my car, I glanced at the screen and saw a message from Monica. Whatever they are offering you, we will double it. Come back now. I laughed very softly. Not because I was amused, but because that sentence confirmed that they had finally read deeply enough. My email did not only say I was resigning, it showed them that 7 others were resigning too. It informed them that key clients had been notified of a new option. It included documentation proving that the award-winning algorithm was only a crude shadow of a far more complete system. It reminded them that their own legal team had once dismissed the original concept as not worth pursuing, accidentally clearing the way for me to develop it independently, without ownership restrictions. I had just opened my car door when I heard hurried footsteps behind me. Grant Mercer, the vice president of operations, had run down 3 flights of stairs, his tie crooked and his breathing uneven. He called my name and said I could not leave like this because the company needed me. I looked at him for a long moment and said, "Interesting. An hour ago, I was not even worth a seat at the ceremony." Grant immediately called it a misunderstanding, a seating error. But I was tired of explanations that only appeared when powerful people became afraid of losing what they had undervalued. I asked Grant whether my name being removed from quarterly reports had also been a seating error, whether Allison presenting my work as her own was an administrative mistake, whether being passed over for promotion 3 times while others advanced using my innovations was just another minor misunderstanding. He did not answer directly. People like Grant are very good at speaking in generalities when the truth is too specific. He told me business was complicated and individual contributions often became absorbed into larger initiatives. I told him I had clearly noticed whose contributions were absorbed and whose were celebrated. Then he shifted into a soft threat, reminding me that the clients I had contacted were bound by exclusivity agreements. I had been waiting for that line. I told him he should reread the contracts. The language prevented them from working with direct competitors of the same type. But Astroroot Labs operated through a fundamentally different framework, creating a new category of service developed independently. Beyond that, several contracts contained performance clauses. Meridian had repeatedly failed to meet. Grant's face went pale. When he could no longer threaten me, he began bargaining. Promotion. Equity. Salary. Titel. Anything I wanted. 6 months earlier, those words might have made my heart shake. I had wanted recognition so badly that an invitation to sit at the table might have softened me. But by then, I understood something that table had never been built for me. I told Grant that what I had once wanted was respect, recognition, and a seat in the place I had helped build. But they had taught me something more valuable. I did not need their table. I could build my own. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw more executives running into the parking garage. The award ceremony they had carefully prepared had suddenly become a performance missing its most important audience, their future. My phone was still buzzing, but I silenced the notifications. Only one message made me pull to the side of the road and read. Paige wrote, "It's done. All of us are out. Meet you at the new office." I stared at that sentence longer than necessary. There is a particular power in knowing you are no longer walking alone. Astroroot Labs occupied a converted industrial space with exposed brick walls, tall windows, and desks we had assembled ourselves the weekend before. When I arrived, my team was already there. Paige, Owen, Sophie Lane, and 4 others, each carrying a private history of being minimized, forgotten, or used as a stepping stone for someone else's rise. Sophie asked whether they had tried to stop me. I told them Grant had chased me to the parking garage and offered me anything. Owen handed me a cup of coffee from the old machine we had just installed and said that must have felt good. I shook my head. What felt better was opening my laptop and showing them the email from our first major client. Not only had they agreed to move their business to us, they had also introduced us to 2 additional prospects interested in our solution. The room fell quiet for a few seconds, then broke into soft laughter, relieved breaths, and brightened eyes. That was not the moment of revenge. That was the moment a real company began to breathe. That evening, we worked late, finalizing our launch strategy. Astroroute Labs would announce its existence the next morning. With our proprietary logistics optimization framework as its flagship product, the patent filings protected our intellectual property. The client agreements gave us revenue from the first day. Around 7:30 in the evening, my phone rang from an unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it, but Paige glanced at the screen and quietly said it was the private line of Meridian's board chairman. I put the call on speaker. Arthur Kingsley's voice came through, low and heavy, saying he had spent the afternoon reviewing the situation and wanted to meet privately to discuss a resolution. I told him my decision was final. His voice hardened. He mentioned Meridian's legal resources, potential confidentiality claims, patent challenges, and the possibility that they could prevent my startup from ever getting off the ground. I asked him directly whether he was threatening me. He called it outlining consequences. I signaled to Owen to record the call. Then I calmly explained that everything I had done was legal and documented. The system had been created on my personal time and personal equipment. I had disclosed no proprietary information. I had simply informed clients that I was starting a new business and invited them to consider our services. Arthur said the clients were contractually bound. I reminded him of the performance clauses Meridian had repeatedly failed to satisfy. The silence on the other end told me he understood. Finally, he asked what it would take to bring me back. I looked around at my team, at the people who had trusted me enough to jump from the old ship. I answered, There are no terms. This is not a negotiation tactic. This is a new beginning. The next morning, the press release went out at exactly 8 o'clock. Just as the trading day began, by 8:15, financial news sites were reporting the arrival of a disruptive new competitor in the logistics industry. By 9, they were reporting the drop in Meridian's stock price. By 9:30, our entire team stood around a large screen, watching my former CEO hold an emergency press conference. The man who had always spoken with polished certainty was now trying to reassure investors that the departure of a few employees would not affect operations. The market did not believe him. The stock kept falling throughout his 17-minute speech. When he announced that Nathan would step down to pursue other opportunities, I felt no satisfaction. I only saw more proof that Meridian still did not understand the problem. They would sacrifice one individual to preserve the culture that had produced him. By noon, Astroroot Labs' phones were ringing constantly. Potential clients, investors, industry specialists, and even former colleagues interested in joining us were reaching out. A week later, before a meeting with our largest new client, I received an email from Allison. The subject line contained only a few words I didn't know. She wrote that she had been told the framework was collaborative and that my small contributions had already been recognized internally. She said she never meant to take credit for my work and apologized. I placed my hands on the keyboard, then stopped. Maybe the apology was sincere. It changed nothing. Allison was a symptom, not the disease. I closed the email and returned to preparing for the meeting. My future no longer depended on forcing everyone from my past to understand what they had done wrong. 3 months after launch, Astroroute Labs had signed contracts with 27 clients, including 3 of the largest shipping companies in the country. Our system reduced client costs by an average of 31%, exceeding even my original projections. The team grew from 8 people to 23. But we hired slowly and carefully. I had no interest in building another version of the place I had left. Every person who joined us needed more than skill. They had to understand that ideas do not become weaker when credit is shared fairly. 6 months after the ceremony, Meridian announced a strategic restructuring. Industry analysts called it a desperate attempt to remain competitive. Their stock had fallen 43% since our launch, and rumors of a potential acquisition spread through financial news outlets. One day, my assistant told me Grant Mercer was waiting in reception and wanted to see me. He had no appointment, but said it was important. I considered refusing, then decided to hear him out. When Grant entered my office, I almost did not recognize the man who had once stood above me in the old hierarchy. His polished confidence was gone, replaced by the face of someone who had not slept properly in weeks. He placed a folder on my desk and offered to acquire Astroroot Labs. The number was enormous. I glanced at it and closed the folder. Grant said it reflected the value we had built and the cost Meridian was paying to compete against us. Then he made a second offer return as Chief Innovation Officer, reporting directly to the board. I looked at him and felt the strangest realization. 6 months earlier, that offer might have made me cry. Now it felt like a key to a room I no longer wanted to enter. I told Grant that my team and advisors would review the acquisition offer, but I would not return as a Meridian employee under any circumstances. I had built a place I believed in, with people who respected one another's contributions, and I was not willing to trade that for a title that arrived too late. After he left, I sat alone in my office and looked out at the desks beyond the glass. People were debating a new model with energy and openness. No one feared their ideas would be swallowed. No one had to hide their talent to survive. I realized the real victory was not that the people who had once dismissed me now had to come to me. The victory was that I no longer needed them to confirm my value. 6 months after that meeting, we declined the acquisition offer and announced an international expansion. 1 year after the ceremony, where I had been told to wait outside, I was invited to deliver the keynote address at the industry's largest conference. As I walked onto the stage, I saw familiar faces from Meridian in the audience. This time, they were not looking at me with contempt. They were looking at me with respect mixed with discomfort. I began my speech with the very words once used to exclude me. "You can wait outside." The entire room went still. I told them those words had changed my life. not only because they hurt, but because they showed me I had been waiting for recognition from people who would never offer it freely. The most powerful seat is not the one someone else saves for you. It is the one you build yourself. Thank you for watching until the end. Please leave one like, subscribe to the channel, and share your story if you have ever had your work stolen, been underestimated, or been forced to create your own path.